Up for this morning, talking about web application security from the front lines. We've got a pretty diverse panel, people from development, security research, consulting, kind of to talk about what people are doing out there to protect their web apps in the real world. So let me introduce our moderator. He's a recognized expert in web application security. Founder and CEO of SecTheory Consulting. You may know him better from his blog at hackers.org and web application security forum at slackers.org. I know it's on my blog roll, it's probably on yours as well. Let me introduce Robert Hansen. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, thank you. We have a pretty light group in here. I realize that there's two other speeches, both with the words "real world" in the title. So I think people like reality television. So let me introduce my panelists. Right here we've got Paul Roberts. He's a senior analyst for enterprise security at 451 Group. We have Jeremiah Grossman, the founder and CTO of WhiteHat Security. Over here we have Mark Kraynak, senior director of strategic marketing at Imperva. And far to my right here is Jeff Williams, founder and CEO of Aspect Security. So this panel is about advanced web application security. I encourage you guys to kind of keep us honest up here. If we hear any red herrings or people dodging questions or whatever, please let us know. Throw up your hand. So let's jump right into this. This is kind of a question to start with you, Jeff, if you like. If you had a client and they could only pick one of two different types of audits, a black box audit or a white box assessment, from an economic perspective, scalability, finding vulnerabilities, which would you tell them to go for and why?
Sure, that's an easy question for me. I'm a huge advocate of white box analysis of applications. I've been looking at applications for 10 years, and I recently sort of totaled it up, and I think I've looked at roughly 500 enterprise applications over the last 10 years. And I've always used a combination of code review and pen testing at the same time because they inform each other. So when you're testing an application and you see something that's a little squirrely, instead of wasting a lot of time trying to pen test it black box style, get into the code and figure out how it works and how it's broken. It's just faster. So I believe that at almost any dollar spend, you're better off. It's more cost effective to use a full white box approach. 2 hours, 2 weeks, or 2 months. It doesn't matter.
Okay. How about you, Jeremiah? What do you think from a black box or white box perspective?
I think it depends on the type of application, really. If you're talking about an enterprise application, probably white box is probably the best way to go. I usually deal with websites, so black box is the way to go. Just my background, I've never actually had access to the source code most of the time. No one wanted to give that to anything other than a developer because they have strict source control. But I think from a result standpoint, price standpoint, speed standpoint, you get the best bang from the buck from a black box approach because it gives you an outside perspective of what an attacker sees, how long it's going to take them to break it, how long is it going to take them to find what.
So what do you guys think is the kind of current problems, implementations with payment processing, with secure implementations of authentication? Are we moving kind of more to a software as a service model for those types of things? Like MS Passport, unfortunately, didn't do very well. But are there other options to kind of offload those types of authentication and payment processing? Maybe a third-party provider, that kind of stuff. Second factor authentication, token authentication. What does the next generation of authentication payment processing look like?
Myself?
Anybody?
Second generation, I think we're still trying to figure out what the first one is. But I think PCI is going to push a lot of people towards using some other service provider so they can get away from the cost of actually conducting PCI assessments and things like that. I think it's just going to come down to what makes the most financial sense. Do I do it internally? Do I take credit card numbers at all and do it that way? And then figure out cost justification to either keep it there or to move it to someplace else. I think the last thing on anybody's mind as far as payment processing selection goes is going to be security. It's just going to be cost.
Anybody on the side?
I would say that today, I would mostly agree with what Jeremiah said. We're worried about a practical problem of authentication, and we're generally worried about people, authenticating people, not transactions. I think one of the fundamental problems with PCI doesn't even really have a lot to do with web security. It has to do with the fact that it's, again, another example of an essentially non-secret secret number, which is your credit card number. And in the U.S., we're probably much more at risk than in the U.K. I was just there 3 weeks ago talking about PCI, and they're in a much better spot from a security perspective because they mostly have chip and pin in Europe. So it's easier to authenticate with a greater degree of certainty. And I think that's probably, if you're talking next generation, something we should be hoping for. But today, I think we need better practical methods for authentication.
Yeah,
Just
go ahead.
I would just like to add on to that real quick. There's sort of two questions there, right? There's one about authentication, and I see a lot of trends towards federated identity and authentication in sort of web services. I think that's a good move. It centralizes authentication in a way that helps. As far as the credit card processing issue, I think the trend towards not storing credit cards is a huge, I mean, if you don't have to store it, you can just take it and pass it on without actually keeping it. That's an excellent trend because you reduce a lot of your exposure that way.
Or one-time credit cards, perhaps?
One-time credit cards helps as well.
Yeah, I know PayPal's working on that, and a couple other credit card companies are working on that as well. So on the topic of PCI, kind of moving around a little bit, there's kind of been a lot of talk about whether it's good or bad for real security versus the kind of the appearance of security. There's a lot of very low-cost solutions out there. We got Scan Alert, Control Scan. I've heard stories from companies saying that they'll actually leave a scanning company because they won't say that they're secure, just to, kind of as a check mark. There's new entrants in the marketplace. I heard yesterday EI is partnering with NT Objectives, for instance. Kind of where are we with PCI? Is it a good thing for security or a bad thing? I mean, are we just kind of pushing the low cost, kind of whatever checkmark type solution, or are we actually caring about security?
I mean, I think that PCI is certainly a very good thing for security companies, we've certainly seen a huge amount of attention both from the investment community and from the enterprise community in application testing, vulnerability scanning, that's directly related to some of the requirements of the PCI DSS. I mean, our position is frankly that if you actually look at the PCI requirements, that these are all things that if you weren't doing them or at least trying to do them prior to PCI, you should probably be ashamed of yourself because you're talking about very basic types of security processes, vulnerability scanning. Basic kinds of data security. But I think it's, I think that it's definitely increased interest, and it's definitely been a very good thing for some of the companies, particularly like Qualys, Outpost 24, that are doing remote vulnerability scanning. I think that it's, you've seen a lot of activity, whether it's in the mergers and acquisition space or in the venture capital space in companies that are doing application scanning, application security as a result of, direct result of PCI.
So question for you, Jeremiah, sub-question. Do your customers come to you and say, we want to be secure, or do they say, we want to pass PCI? Or what's sort of the feeling there?
Actually, that's the first question I asked them. I say, do you want the checkbox or do you want actual security? And because I'm not the low-cost provider, and usually they're plainly honest that one or the other. And they say they want the checkmark. I go, you got to get the cheapest piece of crap vendor you can possibly find, and that's how you get your check mark.
Who do you recommend for that?
You can read my blog. But I think PCI itself, I think, has some really great things and some really bad things. On the great side is I think PCI helps as a driver, and we've actually seen in our company, PCI is helping to allocate dollars to this application security problem, which may or may not have gotten allocated otherwise. But on the downside is it's very much a low-cost provider type of solution. A lot of people like to say this is a minimum baseline for security we build on top of it. I have not seen this. I have seen it as being a top line, not a bottom line. This is what we need to do to get this thing, and we're not going to do any more. So we like to believe it's minimum, but I think it's actually a maximum.
Can I make a comment about that?
Sure, absolutely.
I would say for PCI, I've seen some of what Jeremiah says for sure. My product is a web app firewall, and you can definitely look for a checkbox there. But I've also seen the opposite, where responsible security people can get budget because of PCI, and they get the budget for the 55 things that they know are wrong that they need to fix. And so they get PCI as the club to get the dollars, but they actually do a lot of good. So I think PCI is what you make of it, and you can make something really good of it if you can use it for that justification, because it is a very good, hard stick justification for dollars.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about PCI is that it is a industry-sponsored regulation that actually has teeth. I mean, we made a big deal about FFIEC and about HIPAA, but we haven't really seen any teeth in those requirements because there hasn't really been a strong effort to actually go out and penalize companies for non-compliance. PCI there is, and I think you're seeing companies respond accordingly.
So if you guys were here yesterday and you saw Andy Jacquees, that's how you pronounce his name, his speech, he was kind of saying one of the things that we as a kind of group of people have not responsibly done is saying we're losing this war. In the last few weeks, just to kind of rattle off some numbers, I had one customer hit for almost $100,000 in online fraud. 2 companies came to me to tell me they were hacked. I got a DOS attack from over 500 different IPs, over 400 remote file include attempts, hundreds of refer spams, thousands of splog comments, and on and on and on, and that's just the stuff I was logging. Can we reasonably say that we're winning this war on web application security, and what will be the net effect if we don't?
There's not a chance that we're winning. It's actually, this is a real indictment of the security industry, and I'm the chair of OWASP, and I spend a lot of my time trying to promote web application security awareness, and we're getting farther behind, right? I think we are making slow progress on certain issues, right? Like SQL injection, for instance. I think there's a lot of awareness out there. Some of my customers have stamped it out, but there's new issues getting added at a much faster rate, new technologies that are being added, and we've got to get faster at responding to new technologies. You look at the host of AJAX and RIA technologies that are coming out, people are deploying them, and no one has any idea how to secure them.
They're not even the developers don't try in a lot of cases for rich interface.
Yeah,
they feel like they want to let more information out.
As soon as a new technology comes out, it's like green field for the developers. All the old security rules get wiped off the table and they just start writing code. And we've got to get in front of that. 10 years wrestling with Crosssite Scripting is ridiculous. We've got to be able to identify and eliminate those kinds of problems from our Dan Gear ecosystem faster than that.
And the second part is what will happen if we don't? What's the ultimate net effect of business if we don't win this war?
Well, then I think we hit the Dan Gear scenario, right? Like we'll reach some equilibrium where people stop using things online, and we're prevented from innovating things.
Mm-hmm. Any commentary?
I would certainly say, somebody who's worked within development organizations, that I'm not sure that a new development model like Web 2.0 changes the core dynamic that exists within companies, which is sales and marketing people think up new features for products or new products, present them to development folks and say, do it, and you've got 6 months or 8 months, and the pressure to deliver that on time tends to often exclude security considerations from the development process. I think in certain verticals, whether financial services, that's probably changed. But in other areas, it hasn't. And so, you end up with, the old paradigm of security being introduced at the end of the development cycle as an afterthought or an add-on. And that's just not the way to do it. So I'd like to think that, over time that will change, and certainly some of the acquisitions we've seen, HP and IBM, beginning to introduce web application security into their mainstream coding suites, that might change, but I don't see it yet.
I have a comment. I actually think we need to, in terms of responsible, we need to acquiesce and say that that's the way things are. Business runs these applications. It's always going to have that dynamic, and thinking we can change that is thinking that we can change the way capitalism works, really. So we have to admit that we're going to have to put in some security after the fact and have it have a feedback loop back. So I think one of the reasons why we're losing application security in particular is that the different vendors of the solutions have very different approaches and they fight with each other. Code review versus pen testing versus WAF versus whatever else. It shouldn't be either or. It should be, how do these things work together for an improvement over time? There's feedback loops from an external system into the source code in the redevelopment process, which happens a lot, especially with Web 2.0. It's not 6 months that you have to develop a new feature, it's probably 6 days. And a lot of our customers, they're rolling out changes very quickly. We just have to acknowledge that that's the business reality they have to meet, and given that, how do we help?
Nothing about bongo monkeys?
What's that? Nope.
I find it kind of hard to believe that the security vendors are actually making that big of a difference. Like whether they exist or fight with each other, I don't think it matters at all. I think the developers are out there writing applications, and if we want to actually make the world a safer place for software, we got to change the software market. And the road to that, I believe, is making security more visible. That's one of the primary goals of OWASP, is to try to encourage companies to get security information out about what their people are doing, what their processes are, what their technologies they're using are, make it exposed so the market can help encourage security.
So I think that, not on a just point, but on winning the war, I don't think we're losing the war. I don't think we've lost the war. I think people are coming online in record numbers. There's record numbers of new websites. We haven't discouraged anybody quite yet from coming online and using this particular type of technology. I don't think the war has really started yet because there hasn't been any huge losses suffered by the end user just yet. I mean, if everybody here, I imagine, had some money from their bank account go missing at some point, and it's always reimbursed by somebody. The losses haven't been so great yet. I mean, how much pain has the average MySpace user had to tolerate? How many viruses, people still continue to use this technology. When the losses become and the inconvenience becomes so great that the users then go away, then we're losing, and then we've lost. Hasn't happened just yet. Could be soon, but we'll see.
Or maybe look for an alternative?
Well, I don't know. I think we're agreeing, actually. I think if you're saying things are getting worse, then we're losing, and once people start making decisions to not do things online, then we've lost. I don't know, it's a subtle distinction, but I mean, I'm not hopeless. I think we're currently losing, not that we necessarily will ultimately lose.
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of the statistics about, the polling that's been done around people's feelings about doing online transactions and the security of online transactions, which have shown that, there are, noticeable concerns out there in the general public about the security of doing things online. I mean, I think the goal should be to have have online be a platform that's secure enough that people trust in it, just as they trust doing a transaction in a store. And I don't think we're anywhere near that right now. So I mean, that's an indication of where the battle's going.
So this is the paranoid security room, right? How many people here did not book their airline tickets online?
That's not fair.
My admin did it for me.
So actually, I have a comment. I heard a stat. It's a little bit old. I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but and this guides me when I tell my mom to be online or not be online. Identity theft victims lose about $6,000 or more if they're not doing online banking and online credit card. They lose about $1,000 or less if they are. And that's because, not that they're more vulnerable by being online. Everybody's account is essentially subject to online hacking, but you notice it if you're online. That's probably an indicator that there's some value to being online, even if it's not as secure as it could be.
Okay. So this is a question for you to start, Paul. There's kind of a large trend to kind of knowing your enemy. We're doing a lot more statistics and research, specifically understanding what these bad guys are. There's a number of different projects out there for good or for bad. I know Breach is putting up a bunch of open proxies trying to watch bad guy traffic go through. A lot of Tor exit nodes have been compromised or are set up by gray hats. I think there's a lot of room for ethical gray hat kind of research on the bad guys. One example, for instance, is Google Toolbar. Every single URL that anybody goes to, if they've got anything Google installed, is being pushed back to Google. So they're kind of in a prime place. Same thing with Alexa Toolbar and a lot of other tools. So what sort of kind of ethical / gray hat things are available to us that we're not doing today that might help us learn a lot more about the attackers and kind of how can we benefit by that information?
That's a really good question, and I think I'd add to that. I think there's a company, Secure Sciences Corp, that does. Yep. They monitor, I think, drop sites for stolen credit card information.
Lance James.
Yeah, Lance James. Yeah. It's a very interesting area. I think there is a huge opportunity there The question, as you said, is, you know, are these operations legal? I mean, you are kind of walking a line between, you know, ethical hacking, gray hat hacking, and maybe doing something that's potentially illegal. I think there's a huge demand out there within the financial, you know, within the verticals that are particularly concerned about fraud and online hacking, you know, financial services, government, for consumable, usable information about how different groups are operating online, what information has been compromised and what hasn't. You know, I know, for example, Lance's company, you know, sells their information to, you know, anti-malware vendors further upstream. So
I think one of the reasons they get around that is because they say, well, we're not profiting off of the data itself. We're giving that data back to the Visas and MasterCards of the world. We're only profiting on the data stream.
The data stream, right. And you know, I mean, all kinds of companies do this to one extent or another. If you've got a honeypot set up, and in theory, you're doing some of the same stuff. You know, I think that is in some ways the next frontier, which is, you know, not just you know, blocking attacks or trying to thwart attacks, but actually, you know, you know, Dan was talking about the professionalization of the malicious code community, you know, trying to infiltrate those groups and have actionable intelligence on them to, you know, prevent things before they happen, try and get into that loop between the point where the data has been compromised and when some act of fraud has taken place, and short-circuit that. So.
I'm a bit skeptical of the approach, right? I think that even if you gathered an incredibly large set of data, that you'd have a very difficult time identifying the attacks within it. A lot of application attack traffic is custom to particular targets, and so unless you know what the vulnerabilities are in that target, you'll never be able to identify the attack.
That's where I come in.
I think that brings up a point of reporting. Like, so now you get breached, you have to notify. Sometimes, some states, you have to pay for identity theft. I think what happens is on the good guy side, people are less willing to give out details. They're afraid of the liability. Doesn't seem that it's the same way on the black hat side. So I think one thing that isn't having to do with gray hat techniques is just let's find a way for there to be less liability about disclosure, so that we can learn from the specific attack that does know about the vulnerability, and this is what happened, and here's how the guy did it, and then you can go back to your site or your application and figure out if it's going to be available to happen there.
I should say, I do think organizations should be doing much more detection of attacks on their own infrastructure and monitoring that, because then they do have a chance of detecting the attacks, because they, in principle, they should know what legitimate traffic looks like.
That goes to web application firewalls and all kinds of other heuristic measuring and stuff. Skipping around a little bit, Rich Mogul, who's actually in the other room giving a speech right now, if you want to scurry on over there about reality TV, he actually had a really interesting quote on predicting web security in 2008. I'll just very brief. Oh, and there's one more specific prediction I'll make for next year. Someone will predict a successful SCADA attack, and it won't happen until it does. He was kind of jibbing at Chris Hoff, who actually did predict a SCADA attack, so it's already been done. So, you know, kind of humor aside, you know, what will it take for people to really get web application security, like they do in the virus realm? You know, we've got antivirus deployed pretty much everywhere. We don't have anything like that deployed on the desktop for, I mean, nothing of substance to stop web application security attack. You know, what will it take? Is it a SCADA attack? Is it attack against a government through a web application? What will it look like, and why haven't we seen it?
Well, I think web security is going to follow the same path as every other form of security. We didn't have antivirus software until there were viruses. So until we have mass
But there definitely have been web application attacks.
Right now we have companies like Mark's, mine, Jeff's. Now we have companies that are doing something about it. Until the Sammy worm, there was no research at all anywhere around, you know, cross-site scripting worms and stuff like that. Now there's several different research groups. So it's going to take those massive point-in-time attacks, and then we'll start doing the research on it and how to defend against it.
So there's been probably 7 or 8 massive web application, you know, XSS worms, but we still don't have a kind of definitive way to stop them on the client.
The attacks haven't gotten bad enough yet.
I was going to say that I think for broad-scale awareness, I think it's going to take a successful negligence lawsuit for producing flawed software. every other industry, if you produce a tire or a chainsaw or something that's defective, because it's got obvious flaws that people know about that are almost guaranteed to cause harm, you'd be liable. But in the software industry, we don't have that. And I think a successful negligence lawsuit is out there.
Would that take a governing body to say what secure software looks like, or how would we define?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think we're to the point where we can say certain practices, and you can look at Steve Christie's 5 egregious or unforgivable software security flaws as maybe a minimum baseline of what might constitute negligence. I actually think a negligence lawsuit would not be hard to make.
I think it might be difficult to make because the lawsuit, the event has to happen because somebody did something malicious. So people's natural reaction is go after the guy that did the hacking, not the guy that got hacked. It feels like, I don't know, human nature makes it difficult. I mean, in the case of a tire, you know, the road's not necessarily considered a malicious attacker. It just is what it is, and you're driving over it. And the tire breaks, car crashes, well, it's the car's fault. But I think that's why we haven't seen a negligence lawsuit, because that fundamental human reaction to that suit is to go after the guy that did the damage, not the guy who shared in some respect in getting damage.
So does that mean we need to have a new industry that, insurance for your web apps?
Well, that exists to a certain extent. I mean, a number of the insurance companies have cyber risk insurance that tries to cover that stuff. It hasn't really taken off because companies haven't really seen the risk yet. But I think if there's a credible negligence lawsuit, and I can imagine a set of facts that wouldn't be hard to make, given the state of software security. So I think it's out there.
So I definitely don't like, wouldn't like government involvement in software, having them dictate software security guidelines, but I do like the concept of software liability, both as a vendor, as a consumer. As a vendor, it allows me the ability to differentiate. I'm going to succumb to some sort of liability when you use my product. Perhaps that allows me to get the sale above somebody else. I have to assume liability now, just the nature of my business, and it allows me to differentiate against somebody else. That'll get more common, and I think that it helps to improve software security. It won't make it perfect, but it makes it a lot better and equals out the losses.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to the attacks haven't gotten big enough point. I mean, I'm not sure, given the state of the malicious code writing community today and the professionalization, if we're going to see a blaster or a slammer of web application, attacks, because I just don't think that mass propagation is really where it's at right now and getting a lot of attention for whatever it is you wrote. So I think it's going to have to be something else that's going to be the motivating factor, whether that is lawsuits or what have you.
Katie?
So I have a question, which is how is it supposed to play out in the cases where software companies acquire other software companies? How would the negligence lawsuits play out in that?
There you go.
Go ahead. I'll try to repeat it.
Yeah.
There you go.
So the question is, how is it supposed to be enforceable? How do you envision it to be enforceable, or how is it supposed to play out where software companies acquire other software companies? Is the acquiring company going to be liable in this sort of lawsuit environment for the vulnerabilities that were written by another company, essentially? How long would a grace period be? How long would that company, the acquiring company, have to bring the acquired software up to some kind of standards of assurance? I mean, how is this supposed to play out, really?
I think that would be the theory, that when you acquire, you assume the liability of the software, just like you assume the liability of the debt or whatever else they have in the books. That would have to just go into the overall. At least that would be my theory on it.
Or maybe the insurance policy has some sort of provision. There's a lot of options there. Yes, sir?
So my question is around the potential lawsuits. I have Microsoft end user license agreement right here on the screen, and there is point 15, limited warranty for software and limitation of remedies, and then point 16, disclaimer of warranties. And I don't think that this kind of license agreement that every one of us just clicks accept without reading is unique to Microsoft. So with us basically saying, well, if your software does me bad, tough luck. how do you see the negligence lawsuit there?
Well, it would in that case, but if I'm a vendor selling a competing product, we won't use Microsoft as an example. I mean, it's anything, right? I could say that my software is going to be guaranteed, and I will assume that risk.
I mean, for the
Without getting into all the legal details, there are other legal theories like strict liability and so on that would go beyond the contract, right? If you're grossly negligent in creating something and create a dangerous situation, you may be liable anyway, even though some user clicked, without even getting into the legality of a click-wrap contract. There's layers of legal issues here to go through that's all green field, right? Nobody's ever really challenged these. I just think that if the market's really going to change, that's the drivers, that somebody's going to have to successfully have a negligence suit, and it'd have to be a compelling set of facts.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, software it's not like lawn darts or something. I mean, when the product is dangerous or fails, it's often very difficult to figure out what the source of the problem is, or if it is in fact the software itself or which application. I mean, I think. I think that probably what's going to get companies' attention rather than lawsuits or liability lawsuits, because I anticipate those would be difficult to prove. And I think that, as these gentlemen could attest, that software vulnerabilities application vulnerabilities are widespread and certainly not unique to one company or the other. I think you're going to, if you see a company that's materially damaged or fails as a result of a problem with its software or some kind of hacking event linked to its products, that perhaps that could get the attention of both the companies that buy these communities and the companies that buy these products and the companies that sell them. That there needs to be a different, a higher standard. We haven't really seen that yet. I mean, the worst data breach in the private sector that we know of is TJX, and I think all of us can look right now and say that that breach didn't have a huge impact on TJX's bottom line, although it certainly did have a material effect, but not as big as some people were talking about. That doesn't augur well for the future, I don't think.
I would have two comments. One, on the lawsuit issue with the license agreement, I think there's a lot of precedents in other parts of the world of life where contracts don't matter. Housing, for instance, if you're renting housing to people, you have certain obligations no matter what you put in a contract. So theoretically, you could have that response from the legality. From the perspective of going back to what's going to make people change, I think look at Enron and what it made change in a different part of the security market. People weren't worried about watching what DBAs were doing, privileged users, but at Enron, one of the things that was happening was, the guys whose names we know were calling database administrators to change values in the financial tables, like 2 o'clock in the morning. Then Sarbanes-Oxley happened because of Enron and a few other scandals like it. So potentially the thing that will make people change is a company failure, maybe a massive bank failure that has a huge hack that goes unnoticed for a long time and causes the downfall of that bank and probably a lot of economic fallout, but probably much more massive in scale than TJX, I would think.
Interesting kind of side note here. At least 3 of the people up here write software that could theoretically fail and hurt companies. So there is some interesting parallels there that we have to be accountable to our own software that does the auditing of these companies. So I think there's we have to be. There's some limited liability there, but I think ultimately some people can still sue no matter what we do. This is a question for you, Mark, or to start off anyway. After years of doing IP-based filtering and blocking of users, it seems like we've sort of trained our bad guys how to get around those filters. It's actually very trivial. I mean, it's one of the very first things that bad guys learn on IRC when they're 14 years old. When they get banned, they just switch IP addresses and they keep attacking or doing the annoying thing or whatever. So it seems like all we're doing by blocking is kind of making people smarter. We're not actually solving the problem. And we're not putting them in jail. We're not, fining them or doing anything that directly impacts them. We're just vaguely annoying them. So to me, it doesn't seem like blocking is really working as a kind of a status quo. So is the plan to kind of continue to block, or is there kind of a future look into how we deal with bad guys? I mean, how do we make the attackers stop attacking?
Oh, you won't make the attackers stop attacking, and you won't make them stop getting smarter. So I don't think the premise of blocking is to counteract either of those two things, really. The premise of blocking is to make it harder to get to the asset you're trying to get to than the asset is worth, and to give you time to change the back-end system so that that avenue to the asset no longer exists. So I would disagree. I think blocking is very effective if it makes somebody take a little bit longer. You notice it happens enough to block it. You can then look at what he was trying or she was trying to do and make a change.
But does it actually make them slower?
Yes, it does. I think it has to.
I have particular experience blocking 14-year-old IRC kids. So my background at Yahoo is just part of it. But I was never fond of actually blocking the bad guy, especially at an IP level, because it only made them move, and now I can't see them. I actually prefer blocking the type of attack that they're doing and continue watching them, because now I know where they're from. So that's how I always looked at it.
I agree. I mean, I think it's sort of like a really, really weak strain of antibiotics. We're not actually killing the bad guy, we're just making them move very slightly. And if our microscope is only this attack in this one place and this IP address, all they have to do is not do that one thing again, and we lose track of them. I think there's a lot of kind of genetic, from the previous talk, I think there's a lot of parallels to genetic research and that kind of stuff that says that we're sort of making the bad guys better, not making them worse.
Well, this problem's really built into the anonymity of the internet, right? It's a tragedy of the commons problem, and one thing you can do is you can authenticate more. If you're not a public site that allows people to register at will, if you actually authenticate people, then if they attack you, and you detect it, you can block their account and keep them out from then on. But it's really, there's that level of authentication isn't built into our fabric yet, so.
And one thing you can do by doing that is making it harder to jump around by making it longer to authenticate. Not enough to discourage your legitimate user, but long enough to make somebody who's jumping around take a lot longer to do it, rather than trying to prevent them from authenticating.
So like CAPTCHAs, for instance?
CAPTCHAs, just slowing down requests is one thing. We haven't built that in, for instance, to our product yet, but it's something we've considered. Is if somebody looks like they're doing a brute force, just slow down the requests. It won't hurt a regular user to slow it down to a second or a few seconds response time, but it really makes it hard to brute force something if every request takes longer.
Yeah, I know NetScaler is working on it, or has something like that, similar to that. So, okay, good.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Right in front. Yeah, this is to the previous licensing issue. I just wanted to make a note. I don't think it's going to be necessarily a financial disaster. I think with all the GPS stuff in place and with emergency 911 in place, I think some sort of a hack along those lines on the GPS software and the emergency 911 software is probably going to be more of impact. And I'm surprised it hasn't happened just yet.
I think that might be the case for certain software vendors, but I deal with e-commerce and banks all the time. If even 911 system crashes, they don't care.
Yeah, no. I think the public outcry will solve the issue, and it might become a safety standard like a seatbelt is in an automobile. I mean, until people just started dying left, right, and center.
I mean, there's some interesting parallels there as well. I mean, there's a lot of local area networks inside cars, or personal area networks,
Right.
and if a bad guy could hack that through a web interface.
Well, I heard a
Drive you off the road.
defibrillator or something had just been hacked. I read this somewhere. I wish I could remember right now. Are you familiar with this? I don't know what the interface was.
What's
What did
this?
they have?
A
A defibrillator or something?
I think, is that the case in
Yeah,
Seattle?
wireless. It's a
Pacemaker?
wireless.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's,
It was the whole hospital.
I
and
could also
defibrillator, I
imagine
think was
a voting, like an election fraud kind of issue. It's just one of the issues that'll generate so much public outrage that
Right.
it will focus the attention of the market
I
on
doubt it's going to be
security.
an election issue, though.
It's
We've
gonna
already
happen.
had that, and nothing happened. Anyway. But yeah, I think, where, God forbid, there's people who die. I
Yeah.
think that'll really do it. Even finance is not enough, I think.
Yeah, I guess the question is, where is the leadership going to, given that happens, a SCADA system gets compromised or fails, and that gets the government's attention. I mean, from everything that we understand, the government has a really hard time managing the security of its own software and applications, and probably isn't in a position to be necessarily providing leadership. So where does the leadership come from on issues like application security or web application security, given that the
This panel.
profile of the problem, the profile of the problem might get higher? And I know certainly if you talk to Alan Paller at the SANS Institute, he's advocated for a long time that the government should be using its purchasing power more as an offensive weapon to, goad software companies to improve the level of the security of their products. And I don't know that we've seen that happen yet, but that might be
I think they've
something.
tried. Like
Yeah.
the whole, C2 by 92. I mean, it's been for, what now, 16 years we've been pushing. What?
That's 1992, right?
Yeah. I mean, they've been trying. I mean, there's been programs for the government's been trying to get their vendors to get their products certified under TC-SEC and then the common criteria for years. That hasn't worked.
There is a little bit happening now, though. For example, there's a federal desktop configuration program, FD.
I do like that. I think that's working.
One government program that's happening now is being run by Office of Management and Budget, which is the FDCC, Federal Desktop Configuration, something like that. And basically what that is they've decided to standardize on certain kinds of platforms and configurations. And if you as a software vendor cannot run your software under those configurations, such as a normal user instead of administrator, then the government will not buy software from you. There are other related programs in that area, much of which is being driven by OMB, which is then going to, to me anyway, seems like it is going to have a massive influence in driving software companies to at least move in some directions, at least with respect to applications being forced to run as administrator.
It's a pretty
and
low
so on.
bar, though, right? I mean, that's even lower than the PCI, right? That's like,
It-
can you
it's
run
a-
under this configuration? It's not anything to do with, does it have buffer overflows or access control or good logging or encryption or error handling or
It's a low
authentication or
bar,
anything.
but it is a bar that is 2008 instead of 1992.
Right.
I think the challenge for web security is that we're going to try to create all these best practice standards, and I'm as big a fan of it as anybody, just to give guidance, some guidance to people. The problem is that most of the sites we're used to doing business with, they were written back before most of the attacks that we're dealing with now were even known, created. Or Crosssite Scripting, when did that become known? In 2005 with SAMI? It was around theoretically for a while, but it wasn't until 2005 before anybody really heard about it. Crosssite request forgery, a few of the people might know in this room, no one had heard about it. Most people haven't heard about it. So how do we develop best practice standards for attacks that we don't yet know? I mean, that's the problem with web security. Create these standards that apply nothing to what today's attacks are going to go, going on, let alone 5 years from now.
So that leads me into a next question. So just kind of a one or two word answer from each of you. What do you think is the next greatest risk to web applications on the enterprise over the next kind of 3 to 5 years? If you could name a single attack, what would it be?
Social networks?
Oh, easy, the CSRF, cross-site scripting combos, way deadly.
I think I'd agree with Jeremiah, CSRF, cross-site scripting.
I'm going to say lack of intrusion detection.
Okay. It's interesting that, at least 50% up here don't necessarily agree with one another. I mean, that's not, that's
You
not.
only give us 2 words.
We've been set up.
Well, yes and no. I think we don't have a clear direction, but let's just take the one that 50% of us agreed with. How are we going to solve that problem? What are we going to do? What's the next step to making sure that we, over the next 3 to 5 years, address that problem globally across all the enterprises?
The 451, I think we really believe that this is, by and large, a cultural problem within software companies and within the companies that buy their products, as much as it is a technological one. We see a lot of companies on this panel and on others that are chasing this problem. I think in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen a lot more attention from the venture capital community towards issues around secure coding than we had previously, when it was more focused on point security products. So I think that's all good, but I think you do need to see within organizations that companies first of all identify those key processes that are making them money or that are the most important to them, and really look holistically at how do we secure these vital business processes that are the core of our business, and what tools do we need to do it, both upfront in development process and then post-development in production. And I think, again, you are starting to see that transition. But by and large, I think companies still are in the business of making money, and to the extent that they can get a piece of software, either web-based or non-web-based, to help them to do that, that's going to be their motivator, and security might fall by the wayside. So I think, again, a cultural change within organizations that develop software and within the companies that buy it towards security is going to have the biggest impact.
I would say one thing, we have a lot of the pieces of the immune system that kind of play off Dan's talk. It's got to kick in, and we've got to help it work. So, finding out the different ways that can happen, identifying it, letting people know how to identify it and how to fix it in a couple of different deployment points. I think whether that's in the code, in something in front of the code, in teaching new developers how not to do that in the new technologies. I think there's a certain aspect of grinding it out here that we need to acknowledge.
So the question, how do we fix this stuff?
Yeah.
Is that basically the question?
Over the next 3 to 5 years.
It's not going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. So I think we need a short-term and a long-term strategy. It took us 15 years to build this broken web. If we started today, it will take us at least another 15 years to get it to the point where we consider it today, not to mention all the new attacks tomorrow. Security in the SDLC will make a meaningful impact. Does great stuff, but it's not something we can turn on overnight and just rewrite all the code. The costs are just too astronomical. So we need a short-term strategy. The one that I've come to recommend, because I've seen it working, is the combination of knowing where the vulnerabilities are, finding the vulnerabilities on the website, and translating that knowledge to something like Mark's device in a web application firewall that can stop the problems that we know that exist now. That way, it gives the corporation the ability to have a point-in-time solution that mitigates the risk now, and they can figure out how to deal with the problem later at a code level, at wherever it happens to be. But now they have bought time while not being at risk, because the bottom line is, even if we're finding vulnerabilities out there, and we are by the truckload, most are assuming the risk and staying vulnerable. Nobody is dropping their websites and going, oh my God, we're secure, turn off the website. They're assuming the risk of being vulnerable, and that is unacceptable. But there's no alternative yet until we get this web application firewall VA solution combo going.
So one kind of last question to...
Can I add on to that? I want my shot at
Sure,
answering that, because
sure.
I think it's important, and I agree with the other panelists on this, but cross-site scripting in particular is a problem because that attackers are allowed to inject script into data, and then it gets executed. HTML is probably the worst mashup of code and data of all time, right? You can hide code in HTML in like a zillion places. There's script tags and CSS and attributes and on-mouse over, a million places in it. It's almost impossible to detangle it. And as long as we continue to produce data formats that scramble up code and data, we're finished. You can't unscramble the egg. And so as a sort of a core principle that we need to adopt, as at the W3C and other places, we need data formats that are more effective at separating code from data. The same way that parameterized queries separate SQL code from SQL data and stop SQL injection, we need parameterized data formats that we can use to keep the code and data separate. Otherwise, we'll continue to have injection problems of all kinds, not just cross-site scripting, not just CSRF, but other kinds of injection, LDAP injection, XML injection, all kinds.
So last question. We have a lot of talented people up here on the panel. We have a lot of talented people in the audience. I've seen a lot of you guys before. So if you guys could make kind of one blanket recommendation for a cultural change, not a technology change, but an actual cultural change in the enterprise to really make a major difference towards security, what would it be? So things like, you mentioned secure software development life cycles. A lot of people have talked about actually making incentive programs, so you maintain quality of code, and if you have ship with vulnerabilities, that hits your personal improvement plan, you get less bonuses at the end of the month, that kind of thing. What kind of cultural changes would you recommend in the enterprise that would make the most amount of difference for security?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that I think there just needs to be more awareness at the senior levels of corporations about the importance of application security and secure coding, and I think that needs to come from the top down. I mean, my colleague Nick Selby likes to tell a story about being in Poland and you know, in the late 80s and early 90s when they were selling these Polish-made automobiles that weren't guaranteed to work even when you brought them off the lot. You know, they were sold with no guarantees that they would actually function. And he said to a friend of his, you know, why would you ever buy a car that doesn't have a guarantee to work? And he said, well, you know, because you can always fix a car, but you can't fix nothing. And I'm afraid that the same attitude kind of applies right now to you know, software, which is, you know, I'd rather have it even if it's got flaws because we can address the flaws, but I need the functionality. And I think, you know, I think there needs to be a change in mentality, maybe from that kind of Eastern Europe thought to more of the Western thought, which is to the extent that we're developing software applications or purchasing them, they need to be secure, and we need to know that up front and be confident of that up front.
How about you, Jeremiah?
Oh man,
No,
there's so many cultural changes. Oh.
You can't tell them to unplug the network. It's got to be something else.
So, you know, prior to founding WhiteHat, I was an information security officer at Yahoo, and what I learned there, I learned a lot there, and I also talked to lots of other web security people at various companies that suffered the same problems that I did there. I think what's going on now, in network security, if you're a network security operations person, you actually have security control over the network. If you're a web application security person, you are responsible for website security with zero control over the security of the website. This is a cultural phenomena that only exists right there that I'm aware of, and it has to change. The developers don't work for you. You can't put firewall rules in place to help you. You can do literally nothing except say, this is the right thing to do, and improve it that way. So I think we need to give, at a cultural level, technologically, organizationally, give the security guy more control or more responsibilities. Allocate him some developer time. Give him a web application firewall. Allow him to test the production website without having to get product manager approval. You know, everybody else in the world is doing it, so why not? You know, and it's just those sorts of things that the web security guy has zero control. He needs more.
So I think I'm going to slightly disagree with both Paul and Jeremiah. I think the only way to get to either of those goals, which are both good goals, is to have the security person and the security industry, so that's us, have a better capability to talk about risk and assessment and management, to quantify it. The top executives in a company are managing a business. They don't care about the tactical things until it means something to the business. What is the risk? How do I mitigate it? What's relevant to mitigate? You know, how much effort am I going to try to mitigate this threat, because how much of a threat really is it? And I'm not going to give the security guy carte blanche to do stuff until I know that. So I think risk assessment, risk management, risk quantification is I would say is the deeper cultural change that needs to happen.
So I like that answer, that sort of, you know, you can't fix what you can't measure, right? I think that's a strong cultural change. Problem is, security is really difficult to measure. If you guys go out, Dan Geer just released a 450-page brief on security metrics, which, if you read it, doesn't have anything practical in it about actually measuring anything in application security. It's very interesting reading, don't get me wrong, but you know, I'm skeptical that metrics is a great catalyst for changing a company. So here's my answer. If I had one thing to do in an organization, I think standardizing on a enterprise security API. So rather than have every application reinventing security mechanisms over and over and over again, I think trying to work towards a common security API where you have a set of strong security controls like input validation and encoding and error handling and logging and intrusion detection and so on is a useful thing that you actually can measure, sort of how many applications have moved to this new API and are getting protection. It also doesn't require that you teach everyone in the world 100% about application security, right? Because there's so many things to learn. It is a big space, and developers really aren't going to learn it. They're busy learning how to program things. So we've seen some great success in companies that have moved towards a standard security API for their organization. And if you're interested, check out a new project at OWASP. It's called ESAPI, the Enterprise Security API project, and it's an attempt to define just such an API in Java and .NET.
I'd like to have a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, everybody. Oh, thank you.
Hey, nice job. See you again.
Should be in touch. No fighting, that was good.
Yeah. Hey.
It's built into the fire.
Can't take that one back.
Forgot you're a speaker.